Hello, and welcome to Transformative Travel. I'm your host, Gary White, and with me here, as usual, is my wife and co-host, Ellen Aviva. Hi, Ellen.
Hi.
We are in a very different location than we expected to be. We had to move out of the apartment that we were in below, and we are now on the top floor of this hotel. Internet has not been quite so good up here, so you may experience technical glitches. If we absolutely go blank for a minute or two, just know that we are unable to continue, but we will work with it as best we can and do what we can do. So we have with us today again Cheryl Straffon, who is going to take us to the magical Isle of Crete. Tell us all about it, Ellen.
Okay, well, welcome all to our third salon with author, sacred sites researcher, ritual practitioner, and goddess lover Cheryl Straffon. This time, we will explore sacred sites and the goddess on the island of Crete. But first, let me tell you a little about Cheryl. Cheryl spent the first 19 years of her life growing up in Cornwall before moving to London for coursework and postgraduate work at London University and Cambridge. She later returned to Cornwall, where she has lived. She has written numerous books on topics including megalithic mysteries, pagan Cornwall, Cornish folklore, holy wells, the earth goddess, and the goddess in Crete. And Gary, I think you have a slide of her books.
I'll get them
Books?
up here.
Great. She formerly co-organized and facilitated the Goddess of Cornwall events, as well as organizing rituals and ceremonies at the Glastonbury Goddess Conference. She currently vice chairs the charity Caspin, which looks after ancient Cornish sites. Cheryl and her wife Lana, an excellent dowser, continue to explore sacred sites in Cornwall and Crete, where they have homes. We first met Cheryl in 2014 when she was our guide to a number of amazing sites in mid to south Cornwall. We later met up to celebrate a midsummer festival in Penzance, and just a few years ago in Malta for the spring equinox. So questions can be put into the app, and if we can, we will include them in the conversation. And the recording will be available on YouTube. So welcome, Cheryl. I'm eager to have you take us to Crete, a place I have never visited but have long longed to see.
Thank you, Ellen. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming on to this presentation. We're going to spend the next hour or so, fingers crossed, with the internet links, talking this week about Crete, an island very dear to my heart, where Lana and I do have a house that we built. And we can see there the map of Crete. It's an island that attracts a lot of visitors, and it is an island that particularly appeals to us because of its association with the so-called Minoan culture. And so we're going to be talking about some of that and some of the reasons why we think it is such a special island. We're going to concentrate mainly on the eastern side of the island because that's where most of the sites are from the Neolithic and the Palatial period. The western side of the island does have some of those sites, but it has a lot more recent sites than that, from the Hellenistic, the Archaic periods. The majority of the sites from the Minoan culture are on the eastern side of the island. So it's that we're going to be looking at and concentrating on. I'm going to roughly go through the sequence of the cultures on Crete, but we're going to go back and forth and go around and about, because otherwise it would be all a bit dry, and Crete is certainly not a dry well, it's a dry place, but it's certainly a really interesting place, and culturally it's very amazing and beautiful, and incredible people who lived on Crete. Where did they come from? We're sometimes asked. Well, we think they came from what we call Anatolia, which is sort of present-day Turkey, and also the Middle East. So the earliest inhabitants arrived on Crete, the ones who stayed, in the Neolithic period, from about 7,000 to about 3,500 BCE. They settled in certain parts of Crete, and from this very early period, even then, they began to fashion cultural objects. And in particular, the first one we're going to look at, please, Gary, is the Cato Horio goddess. She is the earliest figurine that we know of from Crete. She was found in a perfect state that she is now. And you can bring her up again, can you, Gary? There she is. And she dates from this very early period, comes from a small village settlement called Cato Horio in southern Crete. She's a perfect figurine of a goddess. She's sitting on something, which some people have interpreted as a snake at the bottom. She has that corpulent shape to her that many of the Paleolithic and Neolithic goddesses figurines have, and she has the face, which is featureless with a sort of beak on it. But this figurine, is something like 6,000 years plus old. You can get reproductions of her. We have one in our house in Crete. She looks after our house when we're not there and watches over it for us.
Cheryl, what is she made of? Is she ceramic or stone?
I think that from this earliest period, people were making figurines out of clay. I can just check that one for you.
She's so fascinating. While you're checking, I'm going to just say she reminds me a bit of some of the corpulent figures found on Malta, with a very large hips and heavy legs and very short arms. Though many of them have just a sort of a point for a head rather than features with a beak.
Yeah, indeed.
That's interesting.
Yeah. She is a clay. Well, I think partially stone and clay figurine from this early period, and it's amazing, really, given the fragility that she.
That she's in one piece. Yeah.
So it's an indication that even from an early period, these people were goddess celebrating. And were creating figurines in order to honor a goddess of the land. They lived in certain places, and they particularly, from this early period, used caves. Now this one that Gary's just putting up now is the Diction Cave on the Lasiti Plateau.
Oh my gosh.
And this particular cave, it's a very popular cave nowadays, so it's very hard to get it to yourself. There are lots of coach tours and lots of people who go to it, but it's a very magical cave. You walk down through the layers. There's a kind of shrine at the top of the cave, and then you go down through the layers to the bottom of the cave. And the bottom of the cave, there's a sacred pool where they found offerings thrown into
Oh,
the pool.
wow.
And so clearly caves like this, and there are there's about 400 on Crete altogether, caves,
Oh my gosh.
were places where people went in order to honor the Mother Goddess, because offerings to her have been found thrown into the pool at the bottom. And just to the side of the pool at the bottom is a little niche, which you could once go into, you can't any longer. But in that niche, there is the legend, which comes from a later period, that the goddess Rhea gave birth to Zeus down there. So these caves were clearly thought to be very sacred places. And in fact, one of the archaeologists who excavated this site described it as a cult cave of the Mother Goddess. There are other caves in Crete on the side of Mount Ida, the Idaean cave. There are also other legends of Zeus. And we can see on the map there's the Idaean cave, which is indicated. And just south of where Knossos is shown, there's another cave called the Scatino cave. And in that cave, bronze votive figurines were placed, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Another series of caves on the south of the island, near to Zakros, are called the caves of the Gorge of the Dead. And this is an amazing gorge running down into Zakros, and it's littered with the caves in the side of the hills as you walk down the gorge to Zakros. And we know that those caves were visited also in the pre-Palatial period. There's Zakros, where the Gorge of the Dead lies. All these places, I think, were liminal places. They were places where people would go from the exterior world, the world of light, into the interior world of darkness. So they were sacred places, platonic places, places where people would go into the underworld and to meet perhaps the dead. In some of these caves, their dead were certainly buried and honored. So caves, right from the beginning of the Neolithic, were important to these people. The Scatino cave I mentioned, we're moving forward now into the pre-Palatial period. And this period is from about 3,500 to 1900 BCE. And in this period, people were beginning to fashion small figurines like this. Now, this is a photograph I took at the Heraclean Museum. If you go around the Heraclean Museum, there are hundreds and hundreds of these figurines that have been recovered from various sites. 90% of them are female, and many of them have a characteristic pose of, as we see on the picture here, the arm raised up and one raised down towards the belly. This is known to be a characteristic pose of votive figurines. It seems that it represents a state, possibly of altered consciousness, that these people would have when they connected to their goddess. And perhaps that particular configuration of the arms was a sign that they could move into an altered state of consciousness where they could connect directly to the deity. The culture in Crete is not a hierarchical one. It's a very equal one in which all peoples had a chance to participate in ritual and ceremony.
Let me ask you a question about these figures. Now, I would, not knowing, I would say the figure in the middle was female and the other two were male. Is that correct or not?
It's hard to tell. There are breasts on the.
Yeah, that's what I was puzzling over.
Yeah, on them. Some are male. It's a religion, it's a culture that was open to everybody, men, women, children, um, and it's interesting because it's one of those cultures, which there are not many
Mhm.
recorded in the world, um, where there was undoubtedly a deity who was a goddess, and the men were equally able to worship the goddess. And give thanks and respect to her. So yes, I mean, majority of the figurines in Heraclea Museum are females. It's about 90% of them, but there are
Okay.
also male ones because
Yeah.
it was a religion for everybody. So yeah, the
Great.
the votive figurines are an indication, I think, of particularly what a religious and spiritual culture that we're looking at here in Crete. Um, so these goddess adorants came from one of the caves. They came from the Scutino cave that I just
Uh-huh.
mentioned. And we often find some of these figurines and some other votive offerings, which I'll talk about in a minute, being placed into the niches in the cave. Um,
Hmm.
and clearly they were an offering to the goddess figurine
Wow.
thought to dwell in the caves, possibly a Mother Earth figurine of some kind. So we've moved forward from the Neolithic into this pre-palatial period. Thank you, Gary. And we moving towards some of the sites that were occupied. Began to build places in this pre-palatial period. This particular one is a place called Pyrgos on the southern coast. Um, these places were often positioned in beautiful liminal places between the sea and the land. Um, and they often took a huge amount of care in the construction of the sites that they built. This place, for instance, at Pyrgos, you can see how they've carefully chosen the limestone pavement running up the centre of the picture because of its purple stones, and they
Ah.
constructed it beautifully in order to run them to the edge of the site by the sea. So where I'm standing and invoking at the edge of the sea, you can really get a sense of how connected the people who lived in these places were to the sea and the sky and the seasons and everything. So
Mhm.
beautifully constructed places, sometimes difficult to get to. The next one, for instance, is Fornikopi. Now, this is a neighbouring site to Pyrgos, and in taking the picture, I'm standing in
Mm.
Fornikopi, looking across to Pyrgos. Pyrgos is on the hill opposite there.
Oh, wow.
Both these sites date from the same period, and both were destroyed in about 2200 BCE, but Pyrgos was rebuilt afterwards, whereas Fornikofi was left. But
Were they destroyed by earthquakes or by?
well, yeah, there's earthquakes, there's fires, there's
Okay.
all sorts of
Natural.
things uh, in the Mediterranean. Crete lies
Okay.
on an earthquake zone, so
So
yeah,
it was natural destruction from
they did,
natural event.
and
Okay.
eventually it helped to destroy the whole culture. But from
Okay.
this early time, they would rebuild um, certain sites, and this one at Pyrgos, they certainly rebuilt. The one at Fornikopi is hard to get to, uh, but it's an absolutely beautiful site. You get a real sense of the ancient Minoan people living there. Um, it consisted of a number of densely packed small rooms, about 90 in this particular case.
Mm.
Um, and there was established there a thriving community, about 6 family units living and working together. Um, when they excavated it, they found that they cultivated cereals, olives, vines. They herded sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. There was equipment found for weaving and pottery, and the making of wine and olive oil. So
Oh,
the past seemed very alive there. It was almost, when we were standing there, and there's nobody else there, of course, you could imagine a Minoan woman coming around the corner.
mm,
It's like time had not elapsed at all.
mm.
There's a real feel of everyday life of the people. There was pestle and mortar still lying about at the site,
Oh
uh,
my gosh.
for grinding spices and herbs, quern stones
Oh
used
my
for
gosh.
crushing grain, decorated bowls still lying about. Um, but as usual with Minoan sites, the everyday um, live side by side with the sacred. Because in the southwestern corner of the site, archaeologists found a shrine, one of the earliest yet known to the mother goddess. And in the shrine, they found a beautiful figurine. Next slide, please, Gary. Which
Oh,
is known as the
oh,
goddess of Myrtos. She's a jug, but she's carrying a jug on the side of the figurine. She's got this long neck, which is typical of a lot of the early goddess figurines. And she was actually found in the shrine at Fornicopi.
oh
Um,
my gosh.
so you get a real sense of how the people live their everyday lives at a site like that, but would also uh, live a very sacred life in which the mother goddess was a part of their everyday life, and they honored her. You can imagine them singing and chanting to her as they went about their everyday business of making the herbs and spices and grinding the grain to make the bread and everything. So the past very much comes alive at sites like Cornucopia, and at the neighbouring site of Pyrgos. Um, Beautiful places. Um, and from this period, there is also the next site, please, Gary, which is called Basiliki. And this is an early site too from this pre-palatial period, but also it lasted into the proto-palatial, um, which is the next period, and into the neo-palatial, the period beyond that. Basiliki consists, there it is on the map, thank you, of a number of houses built. You can see the remains of them in the foreground. And it was clear that they built this place um, very close to a couple of sacred hills behind that you can also see. Um, Now, from certain angles, when you're at the site and when you approach the site, the two sacred hills look like the two breasts of the Mother Goddess, and they were clearly aware of that, and built their site in the lee of those particular hills. Um, they found pottery at this site, which were decorated with dolphins. So the pottery wasn't just utilitarian. Um, uh, the pottery is very beautifully decorated. Um, the settlement consists of, just going back to the settlement a minute, Gary, consists of two separate buildings, the West House and the Red House, and a paved area as well. Um, and there were also sacred areas, just the same as we found at Pyrgos. In particular, in the corner, the southeast corner of the site, was a sacred stone called a Basal. Next one, please, Gary. Um, there it is. Now, these Basal stones are very interesting because it's believed that they were not just stones, but they were thought to be stones that embodied the Mother Goddess herself. Now, you can find them at certain sites. About 7 or 8 have been identified at different sites in Crete, and they're finding new ones all the time. Um, uh, we know that they were thought of as being sacred stones because from some of the carvings that they found, the carvings show priestesses picking the stones. and it's thought that the Minoan people had a concept of what was called the epiphany of the goddess, and this was the descent of the goddess into a human form, who was usually a priestess. And it's thought that these basal stones, and you can find another one at the Malia site that we'll talk about a bit later, but it's thought that on the rings and on some of the jewellery which depicts some of these scenes from Minoan religion, that the stones were thought of in some way as embodying the actual spirit of the goddess, so they became the goddess. So we know that when we find one of these basal stones, we're looking at what was probably the sacred center of that particular site. And in the case of Basiliki, that was obviously it.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Are they? I understand that it's upright and it's
Yeah.
kind of narrow at the top.
Yeah.
Do they have other carvings on them or other distinguishing
Not
relief?
that we found. No,
Okay.
they're not necessarily always the same shape. They can be quite
Okay.
different shapes. The one at Mali is a round one.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, this one looks quite anthropomorphic, so it looks quite human. So you can imagine it representing the goddess and the spirit of the goddess going into the stone. But other shaped basal stones are not necessarily a human in form. But the idea that these basal stones were represented an epiphany of the goddess, that the spirit of the goddess came into the stone, goes way back to the first excavator of these sites in Crete, Arthur Evans. He actually suggested this was the case. And archaeologists have gone along with that ever since then. So there are interesting things to find at these sites, amazing things to find. And we can see then that even from this pre-palatial period, that the people had a sense of the sacredness and of the idea of spirit, which inhabited the places where they lived. So also at Basiliki was found a lot of pottery, which gave it name to a certain kind of style called Basiliki ware. And later on, after the Basiliki ware pottery, which was quite rough in its construction, they refined it. I think they discovered the potter's wheel. And they started to produce much more sophisticated pottery. So we're now moving into the proto-palatial period. And this is some of the examples of the pottery that they were able to construct. This was called Kamari's ware, and you can see just from the slide how beautiful it is. The amount of time and energy that they put into constructing and making this kind of pottery shows that these people had a love of the beautiful and not just the utilitarian. Kamari's ware is named after the cave where it was first found on the flanks of Mount Ida. And the quality and range of the ware is really outstanding. There's the thin-walled vases, bridge-spouted jars, containers, large pots they made called pithoi, often decorated with spirals, whorls, and other patterns that resemble faces and eyes. And these have been interpreted by the archaeologist and anthropologist Maria Gimbutas as eyes of the goddess. So, you know, they took a lot of care over what they made, and some of their work is simply outstanding, you know, even by today's standards.
Beautiful. Just beautiful.
It's beautiful. Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, they made a lot of pottery. They made a lot of jewelry. They worked in filigree. They worked in silver. They worked in gold. When you go around Heraclean Museum, which I urge everybody to do, you can see some of the work that they did. This was a culture who put a lot of energy and effort into making beautiful things. And, as I said before, I think they were things that were not only utilitarian, but also were very spiritual. They connected to spirit. They connected to their deity. They loved their deity. This was a healing deity, a nurturing deity. It wasn't an aggressive, warlike deity. Part of the reason why I'm so drawn to it, to the Minoan culture, simply because it shows a love for nature, a working with nature, um, working in cooperation with nature. Um, uh, it shows a peaceful existence. As far as we know, Minoan people did not go to war with any other nations. They had a naval fleet to protect their culture. But they weren't warlike, they weren't aggressive. They didn't um, put their people down. They allowed them to flourish. They allowed them to express their creativity. At one of the sites that we'll go to in a moment, called Malia, there's a whole quartier mu, where they worked and to produce beautiful objects. And I always when I go there, I always have a sense of these people working in their workshops, individual workshops, producing pottery like this, producing the jewellery, producing the gold and silver, and doing it in love of the goddess, possibly singing to her while they were making it. And doing it in harmony and in cooperation together. So it's, people say these things, why do you love Crete? Why do you love the Minoan culture? I love it because it represents to me all the things that humankind could be, and were once, and could be again, if we only put other things at the center of our culture. Um, and, it's an ideal, I suppose, and we've got to be careful of not over romanticizing it. But nevertheless, all that we know and find from this culture seems to show that they were a people who were in peace with themselves, in harmony with nature, and in love of a goddess. So, yeah, that's why I love it. So,
I'm starting to love it too, and I've never been there, so I'll
yeah,
have to
you
come
have to
and
go
visit
one
you.
day. Have to go.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Okay, moving on then. We come now from the Proto-Palatial period, which was about 1900 to about 1700 BCE, to the Neo-Palatial period, which is about 1700 to 1450 BCE. And this is the period of the temple palaces. Sometimes you just hear them called palaces, but they weren't really palaces because they didn't have a monarchy. And a lot of the things that people think they know about Crete has been shown not to be the case. I mean, Arthur Evans thought that the main temple palaces, such as Knossos, were occupied by the monarchy, but in particular King Minos, whose name he took from the legends and the stories. Knossos is just south of Heraklion, at the top of the map there. But no evidence has actually been found during any of the excavations that there ever was a monarchy of that kind there.
So being British, he just brought his own
he brought his own
patriarchal,
conceptions,
imperial ideas with him.
preconceptions
Yeah,
about these places. I mean, he was very open to the fact that they worshipped the goddess, and we do owe him a lot. At Knossos, he reconstructed a lot of the site in terms of how he thought it might have been. And therefore, there's a lot more to see there than there is perhaps at some of the other sites, which are just a ruin. But nevertheless, we always have to bear in mind that, he came from a Victorian background, and he had quite patriarchal ideas about the people who lived there. This is a more accurate, I think, reconstruction of how Knossos must have been. You'll see it's an amazing site, very sophisticated, 2 stories, 3 stories in some places, buildings. And when you go around today, always try to carry that picture in my mind, because it tells us how it was in the full flowering, really, of its glory. Um, it's quite a complicated site. It is, as been described, the finest flowering of Minoan culture. Um, but you have to know really, when you go around, what you're looking at and what you're looking for. Um, this
Beautiful.
is the throne room reconstructed by Evans, um, and he thought it was where the king dwelt and sat on his throne. Well, the throne's actually been shown that it's far too small for a king's bottom. So the current thinking, even among establishment archaeologists, is that this was a sacred room for the temple priestesses. Um, they believe that the priestess, or a priestess from the site, sat on that throne. One of the reasons why they think that is that the fresco behind shows griffins guarding the throne, and we know that from other sites and from some of the rings found that where you see representations of griffins, um, then they are usually guarding a priestess. So this is now thought to be a place where the priestess dwelt. And thanks to some insightful work done by archaeologist Lucy Goodison, she worked out that this throne room was constructed to face the rising sun at the midwinter solstice. Now, we talked a lot about this last week and the week before. And it shows that cultures all over the world had this idea of working with the rising sun and moon various times of the year. And this particular one at the winter solstice, um, we know that the Minoan people had doors and partitions which they could move and did so between different rooms. And so, putting all this together, what we think was happening here was that at the winter solstice, the priestess would sit on the throne, and there would be other people, obviously, in the room, awaiting the first rays of the rebirth of the sun, which happens at the winter solstice. Um, and as the sun came up over the neighboring hill, a partition would be moved, and the sun would shine directly into the room and shine, Lucy Goodison worked out, directly onto the throne itself. Now, if a priestess was sitting there and the first rays of the rising sun on the shortest day shone into the room and shone onto her throne, the inference is, and suggestion is, that she would then receive the rays of the goddess herself. It was a time of rebirth at the winter solstice, so she, in an epiphany of the goddess, would become the goddess herself at the first rays shining onto the throne. Must have been an incredibly dramatic sight.
Just, oh my gosh.
Um,
Oh my gosh.
it gives us an idea of the kind of things that the Palace Temple site of Knossos was actually about. In a neighboring room to the throne room, there was a small room where certain objects were found. It's called the Temple Repositories Room, and it's here the two famous. I'm sure everybody's seen these so-called
Yes.
snake goddess figurines.
Yes.
They're very famous. Interestingly, we don't find any other snake goddesses anywhere else from this period, from the Neo-Palatial period, anywhere else in Crete, only at Knossos. So it seems to have been a cult which was specifically linked to Knossos itself. Um, when these figurines were found, they were in tiny pieces. And it's been calculated there were probably enough pieces for 7 figurines. Um, but Evans reconstructed, or we had reconstructed, 2 of the figurines using bits of the fragments. So we cannot be certain that these are actually exactly as they were originally. Some parts were remolded, some parts were added to them. But nevertheless, it seems likely that they certainly had figurines like this. And the snakes were found nearby to the figurine. So the person who reconstructed them actually place the snakes in the hands of the bigger figurine.
And Cheryl, the one with the hands upraised with the snakes, what's on her
Yeah.
head?
Well, it's a feline of some sort. Some
Oh,
people
I
say
was
it's
gonna,
a
it
cat,
looks like,
some people say it's a tiger or a leopard. It wasn't actually found in that position
oh, okay,
on her head. It was found nearby, um,
okay,
and the person that reconstructed them placed it actually on her head. Um, and you can see the other one, the one on the right, also has something on her head, and she also has snakes around her waist. So
yes, I see that.
definitely snake energy, Kundalini energy associated with these figurines. The two
And
figurines,
you call them so-called
yes,
snake.
well, because people call them the snake goddesses, but we don't know for certain that they were goddesses.
Okay,
To me, it seems more likely they were probably representations of priestesses
okay, okay.
who were invoking
To a
and
local cult at Gnosis.
yeah,
Okay, okay, got it.
and bringing down the energy of the
Yeah,
goddess.
yeah.
Although they're often depicted like this, in fact, the one on the right on your screen is actually slightly bigger. Knossos thought that she was a goddess, and the snake one on the left was a priestess. Other people have said that they were perhaps mother and daughter. No one really knows for sure because they're only two out of a number originally that were probably there. So I think they were just representations, different representations, some of which have been
Okay.
lost.
So I hadn't realized that this was the only place where figurines related to goddess or priestess with snakes,
Yeah.
that it was only there at Gnosis in the
From that
room next
period, from the
from that period.
neo-glacial
Okay,
period.
okay,
Um, there are other snakes, but they come from a much later period, and we'll look at them
okay,
a bit later on.
okay.
But they're certainly magnificent examples. You see them everywhere. You see them in. You can buy earrings off them in Crete, even on T-shirts. I don't know
Oh
whether you
my.
can see. I've got one on my
Oh, look at
T-shirt. There you
you. Look at
go.
you.
There she
Aha.
is.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
So
how large are these statues, more or less?
about 6 inches,
Okay,
6 7 inches
okay.
tall. Yeah, I mean, how they were used in the ritual space, we cannot know for certain. Perhaps the priestess in the throne room held one of them. Perhaps they were brought out at ritual ceremonial times and placed in significant places in the room. We don't know.
Okay.
Those things have been lost. But we still have the figurines, which are very inspirational and quite amazing.
Wow.
So, yes, snake goddesses. Knossos is known for other things as well. They found their examples of both Linear A and Linear B script. These are the first writings from this period. Linear B script has been deciphered, um, and most of what we have is like lists of things, and provisions to be obtained, and so on. Linear A script has never been properly deciphered, so it remains. We don't have enough scripts and examples for us to be able to decipher it properly. Perhaps one day it might be. There are fragments which are intriguing, which we think can be interpreted. Some work that was done by Marina Moss uh, as a PhD on this is quite interesting. Um, she says that some of the words used in the Lineae refer to priestesses at the temple
Hmm.
and goddesses, like the goddess of the four winds and so on. But we can't interpret the whole Lineae yet. Um, and of course, there's the whole business about the labyrinth, which is associated with Knossos. The whole story of Theseus and the Minotaur is indelibly linked to Knossos. Again, that's an enigma. Um, Knossos is not a labyrinth, though some researchers, like Rodney Castleton, thinks perhaps it originally was, with all the rooms leading off one from the other.
Mhm.
Um, but the story of the labyrinth is in some ways always linked to Knossos, and we don't really know why it has been. The story tells that a minotaur, a half human, half bull creature, lived in the center of the labyrinth, and 7 youths from the mainland were sacrificed to it every year, and Theseus came to kill the Minotaur, was aided in that by Ariadne, who helped him into the center of the labyrinth and helped him out of it after he killed the Minotaur. Theseus took her away to the island of Naxos, where he abandoned her, and went off and did other things. So, it's a myth story from a much later period than this, but somehow it's always linked to Crete.
I'm just going to point out it's a quarter of the hour.
Yeah.
So you have about 15 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. We have a few more slides, but I think we'll come in on
I
time.
don't want to miss any of them, so I just want to make sure.
Yeah. And also found at Knossos were these wonderful frescoes. They found at other sites in Crete, but some of these in particular.
Oh, how beautiful.
This one is quite well known. It's called the Blue Ladies. Arthur Evans thought that they were ladies of the palace, high-ranking ladies of the palace, and they were sitting there discussing fashion with each other. It seems much more likely that they were actually priestesses. And the reason we think this is that one of them is wearing a necklace, and it's an identical necklace to one that was found at a burial site, Arhines. And we know that the burial site was of a priestess. It's found with lots of other beautiful jewelry. So we think that was a depiction of perhaps the priestesses of the palace temple site. The second fresco, which Gary gave us a flash of just there, is the Bull Leaper. Have you got that one?
I'm not sure whether he isn't frozen.
Is he frozen?
Gary?
No, I think he's frozen.
I think he's frozen. There he goes. Okay, he's back.
Okay, we're back again. Now, ball leaping, of course, is well known about and very much associated with Minoan culture. It's possible that they did have exhibitions of ball leaping in the center of the palace temple site. All these palace temple sites have a center court, and they're all orientated in exactly the same way, north, northeast by south, southwest. And it's a big public area where people could watch special exhibitions and things that were put on. It's possible that the ball leaping took place in these center courts. The fresco illustrating it shows a woman at the head of the bull holding the bull's horns. A man, we know they're female or male because of the color. Females are colored white and men are colored orange or dark colored. The man is leaping over the bull, and the woman at the back has her arms out ready to catch him. Now, this looks absolutely incredible. It looks completely impossible. You'd think it was a fantasy thing that they just made up. Well, no way. It's actually still done in the south of France. They still do bull leaping. They don't do it for sacred purposes, as they must have done in Minoan times. But it is feasible to do it. Obviously, the bulls were tamed in some way or were pacified in some way. Clearly, the bull wasn't hurt. It wasn't like a Spanish bull killing. Right. So it was clearly an important part of their culture. It shows off their athleticism and their connection to the world of animals. So yes, there are many of these fabulous frescoes, different places, and you can see most of them in the museum at Heraklion. The other thing to notice of interest at Knossos is that as you go round, next slide, Gary, if you're there. Please.
Wait, do you want this to be that one or the double axes?
These are the horns of Consecration. Oh yeah, the double axes. Can we go back to the double axes? Yes, thank you. The double axes that are found in Greek known as labris. These were not axes that were used in warfare. These were ceremonial axes, Some of the early pottery that you find shows part of their decoration, their motifs, butterflies, and some of them, particularly in a museum in Satia, I've seen them with the butterfly shapes metamorphosing into a double axe shape. So I think they come originally from a butterfly shape that was connected to Mother Nature, and they became stylized into these double axes. But double axes or labrises are very much a function of Minoan culture.
Cheryl,
Um,
did they also have single axes?
um, yeah, there were some single axes, but mainly it's double axes that you
Yeah,
see.
because I'm really struck. We were watching something on Stonehenge and the latest
Mm,
discoveries on some of the big stones,
yeah,
and there are all of these single axe patterns that look so much like half of that. I
yeah,
mean, and that was like 2500 BCE probably.
yeah. Well,
But
maybe there was connection, but
yeah,
it's the double axis is typical. And you
okay,
see these double
okay.
axes carved, they call them mason's marks on some of the walls of some of the sites, um,
Ah,
some of the palace temple sites.
wow.
So they clearly probably carved them to represent this is a sacred room. This is
Oh,
a place
fascinating,
where, rituals
fascinating.
took place. And the other thing to notice from Knossos, next slide please, is the horns of consecration. Again, this
Oh,
is a Minoan symbol. You'll see the horns of consecration all around. These are very large ones. They originally would have hung probably over the southern entrance to the palace temple site. Now it's freestanding. Um, and these these horns of consecration can be seen in the landscape. I mentioned Basaliki earlier on, and those hills. Well, from certain angles from Basaliki, you can see the horns of consecration as two mountain tops actually in the land itself.
mm.
Looking from this horns of consecration at Knossos, we're looking up towards Mount Euctus. Now, Mount Euctus was one of their peak sanctuaries. This was another characteristic of Minoan culture. They would travel to the high spots, which were peak sanctuaries, and this is Mount Euctus, and this is the cave-like hole at the top of Mount Euctus, and there they would throw their ritual offerings um, into into the holes, or place them actually in the peak sanctuary itself. There are quite a number of peak sanctuaries all over Crete, and therefore it was obviously a sacred journey from some of their sites to these peak sanctuaries to perform some of these religious practices. And at this one on Mount Euctus, they found silver double axes actually thrown down into the hole, along with other offerings as well. So these peak sanctuaries were sacred sites as well. Um,
Huh.
so moving on again.
Oh, that just says so much about their relationship to the land
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and the mountaintops, the peaks, the
Yeah,
caves, the
yeah,
high places, the deep places.
absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, they
Okay.
did. And even when they built their palace temple sites, they would bring some of the notions of the outside into the palace temple site. Um, they used to have certain underground rooms that they built into places like Knossos with pillars in them. They're called pillar sanctuaries. Um, and it's thought that these were supposed to represent trees and things from outside that were being brought actually into the palace temple sites themselves. And
Mhm.
as you say, their relationship to Mother Nature was profound. This beautiful gold object
Oh my
is a
gosh.
bee goddess, um,
Oh
and
my
represents a
gosh.
bee, and was clearly worn probably by a priestess of the site at Malia, which is another one of the palace temple sites. Um, this was found at there's Malia on the top of the map. This was found at a burial site called Chrysolakos, just outside Malia. And the thinking is that the people who were buried were high status people, like the priestesses of the site at Malia. And this was probably a necklace, came from a necklace that she wore in her role as priestess at Malia. And it shows both their beautiful filigree work that they did in constructing, making these things, and also their relationship to the natural world, which they clearly loved and worked with. So yeah,
wow.
that's an example of a beautiful gold object, which you can see the original in Heraclea Museum. Next one, please, Gary. And another palace temple site um, was at Festos in the south of the island. Um, and as we see there, again, the palace temple site was built in relationship to nature, because the mountain in the distance is Mount Ida, the mountain I mentioned right at the beginning, which was one of their sacred caves, um, where they went to liminal places in order to connect with the spirits of the dead and place their offerings. So from Festos, down in the bottom left of the map, um, they could see Mount Ida, which is in the center of the map,
Yeah.
um, and they would perhaps go on sacred journeys, processional routes to places like Mount Ida to place their objects. So we're getting near the end. We're It's been a hasty canter through some of my own culture, but
Yeah.
I hope I've given you some indication of some of the ways in which they express their spirituality, and some of the beautiful objects that they constructed, and some of the sites that they built, and some of the purposes they might have built them for. And I want to finish with the final slide, um, just to round it off. This Neoplacial period, this flowering of Minoan culture, ended in a very precise date, 1450 BCE, when a huge fire, a conflagration, swept through the island of Crete, destroying most of the sites. Now, whether it was a natural occurrence that brought about by an earthquake or not, we don't know, or whether it was brought about by an invading culture called the Mycenaean culture, who came into Crete at that time. We don't know. But in any case, the whole culture changed. We know there were places that the Minoan people fled to, um, safe sites on the side of hillsides like Carpe and so on, where they continued to worship a mother goddess. But the interesting thing is that the Mycenaean incomers, possibly with help from the Minoan people, continued to be goddess worshipping. Only they created different goddesses.
Ah.
And these very much larger goddesses, these are something like waist height,
Oh.
start to be made from this period. Generally, they're called goddesses, GUAs, goddesses with upraised arms, and they're found
Oh
in
yeah.
many of these post-palatial sites. So even though the Mycenaeans came in as an alien culture, and even though the Minoan culture, to all intents and purposes, finished, nevertheless, either because of the influence of the Minoan culture, because it was such a strong goddess worshipping culture, or because the incoming Mycenaean people wanted to provide continuity for the people, the Minoan people of Crete, they certainly continued to honor, worship, and celebrate a goddess. And there are dozens and dozens of these figures being found, and you can see them in the Heraclea Museum. So
Oh,
we leave the Minoan
amazing.
culture there, we leave them with the Mycenaeans having come in, but they still continued to celebrate
Oh,
and
that's
worship.
and
Well,
still
thank you
do.
so much.
Thank
Still
you.
do. I mean, you and Lana. I